Welcome to B-Sides Live, a podcast for music lovers by music lovers. I'm Dan Baxter. On today's episode, I'm going to be joined by my good friend Josh Mackenzie from Vinyl Spin YVR, who takes us through the history of the greatest Canadian band of all time, the Guess Who. Josh was one of the very first friends I made on the Instagram vinyl community, and we realized that we both loved a lot of the same music. So he was kind of shocked to hear I didn't really know the Guess Who very much. And so ever since he's been pushing them on me, my life hasn't been the same. Throughout this episode, you'll see Josh's username listed as VinylSpinYQL. That's actually his old username, and he recently moved to Vancouver, so he is now VinylSpinYVR. So definitely go give him a follow. I will link his information below. The music really helps with these discussions, so there is a full playlist of this episode linked in the description below if you want to follow along. Otherwise, there is a calendar page down there as well that you can check out to see when you can make it to the next show. We do these all the time, kind of talking about all various types of bands and things, so we have a lot of fun. Subscribe if you like. We'd love to have you. Otherwise, enjoy the episode. This is the next of our Get to Know sessions. We're doing Get to Know the Guess Who. Just so you know, this is a bit of an active chat. So if you want to open up your chat box, share some stories, talk about some of the songs that are really vibing with you today, or just whatever's going on in your life. So we're here for a good night. Hope you have a beer. I've got some Molson Canadian, and then behind me I've got a fridge full of Labatt Blue for the rest of the night. So I'm in for a good night. I'm gonna kick it over to Josh here in a minute, but I just wanted to say thanks again, and without further ado, let's get to know the Guess Who.
All right, how's it going, guys? I'm Josh from Vinyl Spin YQL on Instagram. Like Dan said, I want to say a quick thanks to everyone who's joined so far, and thanks to Dan who's let me team up with him to put on this awesome show. I'm a massive Guess Who fan, and I've got my Canadian here in the can. So we're ready for a great night. Before I get into anything, I want to give a quick happy birthday shout out to my mother who's watching right now. It's her 50th birthday today. So happy birthday, Mom. And I want to dedicate this show to her because she's a massive Burton Cummings fan. And that's where a lot of my influence comes from with my great music taste here. So yeah, that was the Guess Who in 1965 with their first hit, Shakin' All Over, which was a cover of Johnny Kidd and the Pirates song. And they actually received a lot of success in the US, in Canada and the US with that song. So they had a lot of success there. And then there was kind of a blank area where they were, still trying to make it. And things weren't happening for about 5 years or so. They were, at that time, just a couple of young guys in Prairie Town, Winnipeg in Canada. And Winnipeg, there was a lot going on at that time in Winnipeg. They consider that, music historians will say, consider Winnipeg sort of the Liverpool of Canada. You've got the Guess Who, which spit out additional acts with Burton Cummings, solo later, Randy Bachman, also Neil Young, and another guy by the name of Terry Jacks, if you know the song Seasons in the Sun, which was an international hit in the 70s. Later on, Crash Test Dummies in the 80s. So a lot of stars came out of Winnipeg, especially in the 60s and 70s, though. They were really close with Neil Young. They hung out with him quite often. And Neil Young, in fact, let the Guess Who hear the debut album of Buffalo Springfield before it went out, which led the Guess Who to go and cover Flying on the Ground Is Wrong, which leads me into the next song. So let's jump straight into that. Okay, so I should probably clarify, with the first song we listened to was Shakin' All Over, that was pre-Burton Cummings. So we'll consider that original lineup. If we compare to the Beatles, we'll consider that sort of the Quarrymen days for the Guess Who. So from that time, they launched Shakin' All Over. They tried a bunch of stuff for the next 5 years. They didn't see any major success since then. They even attempted to tour the UK. They set up somewhat of a tour, and they arrived over there with all of their gear and everything, and something went wrong, and all of their dates were canceled or something. And so they were stuck there, no money. They had to come back, and yeah, they were out a ton of money because that was a complete failure. And then they met a guy named Jack Richardson, who went on to create a record label called Nimbus 9. If you've ever heard of the Nimbus School of Music, it's an worldwide music recording school in Vancouver. Anyways, that was started by him with Nimbus. But anyways, so they scored a deal with Jack Richardson here to create their next album, which we just listened to with Mr. Nothing, is this guy right here. Now, enough copies went out to actually qualify for a gold record, but it didn't earn gold record status, and here's why. This album was in a partnership with Coca-Cola. So back in those days, you could collect bottle caps and stuff and submit them back to companies and get maybe a pack of hockey cards or something. In this case, if you collected 10 bottle caps, sent them back to Coke, you'd receive this album, A Wild Pair. And that did quite well in Canada. It was a big success. They were actually teamed up on that album. Guess who was on the B-side? And on the A-side was the Staccatos. So, and again, I'm just referring to my notes here. But since they began that relationship with Jack Richardson, here was the next step. Jack actually mortgaged his own home to fund their next album, which became an international success. It's called Wheatfield Soul. What I love about these early albums with all artists is that you can hear all of their major influences. You know exactly who their musical heroes are, who they're trying to sound like, and you may sound something that sounds a little familiar to that of The Doors. With that, we'll head into this first song that you will definitely know.
So with Wheatfield Soul and their next album, which was this one, Canned Wheat, they actually had a handful of hits. The only one that most people probably wouldn't recognize is Friends of Mine. And there's a bunch of other really good ones that were really successful in Canada and the US and even other parts of the world. But none of those will amount to what was next to come, the next album, American Woman. And you got to remember too, so this is late 60s. The Guess Who were the first Canadian band to really make it successful as a successful group without leaving, going into the States. There were other Canadians that made it, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and a couple others, Steppenwolf, that had made it at that time already, but they had all moved to the US. Everyone had to go to LA or New York to be recognized because the music industry wouldn't pay any attention to Canada. So the Guess Who, kind of like the Beatles to England, they really paved the road for that to happen. So yeah, we're going to go into American Woman, which was the height of their career. Totally. They actually outsold the Beatles in 1970 with this album. And then unfortunately, Randy Bachman left after that. So with that, we'll go into the next song. All right. So those last couple songs are from the American Woman album, and then that last song, Share the Land, was from their Share the Land album. So like I said before, Randy Bachman unfortunately left for reasons I won't get into after American Woman, which was the height of their career, the biggest success they saw. They had really made it, and Randy decides to leave. You can look into that on your own. But anyways, Share the Land was basically Burton Cummings taking over his lead, and he's got to fill the shoes and be the leader and put out the next hit. So he recruited a new guitarist from Winnipeg, Kurt Winter, and they put together this next album. A lot of people think after Randy left, the band immediately declined, which is not true. They still had plenty of top 10s and even number ones in the US after that. So and then that photo you saw of that performance when they debuted as with the sort of new lineup with Share the Land, when they were first kind of establishing themselves, they were a little sheepish to promote themselves as the Canadian Prairie Boys from the Great White North, from who knows who's ever heard of Winnipeg. And eventually they got to a point where they were really proud of it and they wanted to say, yeah, we're from Canada. So they draped this flag over their piano. This is on the Johnny Cash show. And they were super proud and they thought they were doing an awesome thing. And then they actually got a ton of flack and negativity from Canada because the flag was draped on the floor, which was seen as super disrespectful. So that kind of backfired on them. Anyways, without further ado, let's go into the next song on the Share the Land album. Okay, so I thought I'd show you guys my copy of this record here, Artificial Paradise. It's a really cool jacket. It was really expensive for them to produce at the time, and I guess there's kind of started in the early to mid 70s where people started producing more complicated or interesting album jackets. So this one is actually a real envelope. There's tons of stuff inside, tons of goodies. But they actually designed this to look like, I can't remember the name, but there was a really popular sort of like a high stakes, really like scammy, suspicious junk mail that would go around, that would say things like win more cash than you could possibly use in a lifetime, win big bucks fast, never have to work another day in your life. And so if you open it up, there's tons of goodies and like flyers with just like really scammy looking stuff. So it's super cool. The next song on this album, if you're a big Beatles fan, you may have heard the story of Obla Di Obla Da, how Paul McCartney came up with the lyrics, where he heard a Jamaican say the phrase Obla Di Obla Da, life goes on, man. And he thought that was really interesting. So he turned that into a song, super Beatle-y thing. So with this next song, it's called Hambla Gajla. And Burton Cummings basically did the exact same thing, pretty much the exact same story. He heard they might have been on tour somewhere in Jamaica or Africa or somewhere. And anyway, he heard someone say this saying, which I can't remember the exact meaning, but it's basically like good wishes and that kind of thing, and turned it into this kind of song. So let's go into that. We're on to the number 10 album right now. So before we go into the next song, which is called Glamour Boy, I just wanted to talk about the inspirations of it. So this song Burton wrote about David Bowie. So 1973 was right around the time where glam rock was coming into popularity. David Bowie, Queen, many others. And the Guess Who, Burton Cummings, they were all really they were real casual guys. Like I said earlier in the chat, they would perform just wearing, jeans and a flannel, unshaved beard, or even hockey jerseys. And they weren't about the show. It wasn't a visual show to them. It was about the music. So they're seeing this rise in glam rock. And honestly, with all of that coming into popularity, bands like the Guess Who were sort of slipping a bit out of the spotlight. And so they were a little annoyed by that, but also you notice in the lyrics just some things about this song. Burton was sort of inspiring, or encouraging Bowie to come out of his shell and just be his true self, and just be him. So let's go into Glamour Boy. Okay, so now we're on to Road Food. I know Dan loves this album, and for good reason. It's pretty interesting. Um, it kind of further emphasizes the point I made earlier about the Guess Who not really being about image, just being super, whatever and casual. And this album cover just says it all. This like half-eaten, or I guess it's not eaten yet on the cover, but on the inside sleeve, it's half-eaten and garbage and stuff. And I just love having the track listing on the receipt there, and on the other side of the inner sleeve too, they're just stuffing food in their mouths, and they've got sauce dripping down their shirts and stuff. And but that was sort of about to change. Burton got a haircut and became a lot more cleaned up from here on. So we're in 1974 now, and at this time they're about 5 years in the spotlight, and they're a well-established band. They've played started playing on the Midnight Special quite often, and because of that, they got quite close with Wolfman Jack as the host. Yeah, you can see in that photo, they're just wearing like jerseys, flannels, and just not caring about their look whatsoever. And so with getting close to Wolfman Jack from playing quite often on the show, this next song is a tribute that they wrote to him. Okay, so only a couple more songs to go. So that was Power in the Music, their last album as the Guess Who. There were technically a couple more albums, and I found a good way to explain it last night. And I think Andrew, who's watching, might have different views than me on this. We'll see. But So there's technically 2 more albums. The group split up. Burton left. Everyone decided to close it up. The Guess Who was over. Jim Cale, former original bassist who was no longer in the band at the time when they split up, realized that the name The Guess Who had never been trademarked at all. So he went on, started a new band, new members, and they put out 2 new albums. They did have some former members like Kurt Winter come back for, I think, one of the albums. But ultimately it really wasn't The Guess Who, especially without Burton and Randy. And here's kind of how I explain it is imagine the Beatles breaking up 1970 and Ringo decides to start it up again with their old roadie, Neil Aspinall, Pete Best, their old drummer, even though maybe I shouldn't have said Ringo, both drummers. But anyways, it's the Beatles, but it's not the Beatles. So that was the end of the Guess Who as we know it. And for these last 3 songs, this is possibly my favorite part of the show. There was one more album put out. It was put out by their producer, Jack Richardson, to pay homage to the original lineup, the original famed lineup, which included Burton and Randy. These songs consist of what would have been the album to follow up American Woman if Randy Bachman had stayed in the band. And I'm actually going to read this little write-up here that's on the back by Richard, Jack Richardson, their old producer, because it's really awesome and really pays homage to the group. So the original Guess Who, or I guess I should say my original Guess Who, for there were other members before them of Randy Bachman, Burton Cummings, Gary Peterson, and Jim Cale were responsible for some of the biggest hit records to ever come out of Canada. These Eyes, Laughing, Undone, American Woman, No Time were top play records in the late 60s, and all of them were the magic of these 4 Winnipeg musicians. In May of 1970, Randy Bachman left the group and went on to huge success as Bachman Turner Overdrive. Burton Cummings is now embarking on a solo career. Gary Peterson is working with a group out of Philadelphia called, oddly enough, Delphia, and Jim Cale is in the management booking end of the business. So the Canadian invasion, as it was labeled back in 69 and 70, is over, and the troops have dispersed to do their own things. This album represents the last recordings from that Canadian invasion of my original Guess Who, recorded at RCA Studios in Chicago in the spring of 1970. These tracks are The Guess Who, As They Were, and Never Were Again. So with that, let's go into the last 3 songs of the show. First one called Running Down the Street.
All right, well, I just wanted to, before we hop into the last song here, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining. Thank you, Josh, for putting this together. It's been, I know we've chatted a couple times over the past few months, but you did a fantastic job with this, and I hope everybody enjoyed the playlist he put together. I just sat back and enjoyed the show like you guys, so I'm finishing my my last Labatt here. Thanks again to Josh. I'm gonna turn it back over to him, and thanks for hanging out, guys. This has been a blast.
Yeah, thanks. It's been awesome, and thanks to Dan for giving me the opportunity to collaborate on a show through his account, B-Sides and Beers. It's been so much fun, and I've loved getting to spread the love of the Guess Who to you guys, and I hope you've enjoyed this sort of album-to-album beginner's guide. And for those of you who weren't Guess Who fans before, I hope you're converted to mega fans now. I will sort of come out about this. So I've always been a lifelong Guess Who fan through the hits, just hearing my parents play them growing up. I've always loved the Guess Who, Burton Cummings, Randy Bachman. It wasn't actually until January last year, so just over a year now, where I decided to really dive deep and really get to know the Guess Who. And since then, I've just turned into a mega fan. And they definitely, I can honestly say, even though we're not through the pandemic yet, they've definitely gotten me through COVID for sure. And it's been awesome. So yeah, and we've got one more song left called Take the Long Way Home. And yeah, I feel free to chat me up later, follow my account, and I love talking about the Guess Who. That's how I've made some of my closest friends through my Instagram account, 2 of you which are watching the show right now. So yeah, let's go into the last song. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in.
Cheers, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in.